Good morning, everyone. My name is Eszter Szenes. I know most of you, but some of the names are unfamiliar to me, so thanks for being here. Some of you also already know about this work. So some of the things that I'm presenting on today, you've seen already, but there's some new stuff in it as well. And I guess I'm mostly interested in the discussion part, so I don't want to talk at you for too long. I'm going to show you some snapshots of the data and what we found. But I guess I'd like to focus more on the discussion than and the ethical considerations that came up after we finished analyzing a whole bunch of data. So the title of my talk, as you've seen from the abstract, is Empowering Whom, Cluster Boosting Australian Values and Cluster Fucking Foreign Values in Reflective Writing. So just a couple of words about the context and the research problem. I'm sure that most of you have seen these university mission statements where graduate attributes include things like ethical reasoning, ethical decision-making, and professional integrity. These are often listed in these graduate attributes as crucial components of professional ethical practice. A lot of these attributes are often assessed through critical reflection assignments, things like reflective journals, critical reflection essays, portfolios, and there are a lot of different names that different disciplines use. So there are a few quite ambitious claims in the general literature on reflective assignments. The literature claims often that these assignments focus on creative expression that do not conform to any structures, that they allow students freedom to engage with their experiences without limits, and they are also often framed as empowering and emancipatory. So where does this come from? Critical reflection is considered a form of critical thinking, and a famous thinker is John Dewey, whose work is still very influential today. He defined it, he said, "We do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience." And then another quote that's very often used is that critical reflection is an active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it, and further conclusions to which it leads. It concludes a conscious and voluntary effort to establish belief upon a firm basis of evidence and rationality. So in previous research, ethical issues have already been pointed out, especially the Western bias towards cultural assumptions and norms, for example, excessive focus on individuality. And they often use expressions that include the word self, things like self-expression, self-regulation, critical self-reflection, self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-correcting thinking. Previous research also pointed out that sometimes these reflective assignments are almost like censorship, and more harsher critiques of critical reflection assignments talk about coercion and intrusion into students' privacy, or saying that these assignments overburden students with busy work and more workload. Since we started looking at critical reflection using LCT, we have quite a lot of evolving and ongoing work in LCT on the knowledge practices of critical reflection that is really great to see, because in previous research, we have also somewhat critiqued the existing literature for being really so vague that it's almost not usable. Some of the claims in the previous literature also claim that critical reflection is not accessible, and it's not teachable, and it's not learnable. And all of the work that was done from LCT in nursing, in English for academic purposes, in social work education, in teacher education, and on social work and business studies actually show that these assignments can be analyzed, can be taught, and we can teach students how to achieve what lecturers call successful critical reflection. So a lot of these analyses by many of these names that you already know focus on things like what the genre structure is based on a particular discipline. For example, what is the staging of these assignments? Analysis found recurring patterns of recurring linguistic resources. From an LCT perspective, a lot of this research found that successful critical reflection depends on the ability to wave, so move between different types of knowledge practices, moving between theoretical knowledges and everyday experiences in these assignments. So in fact, a lot of these assignments do have form, despite what the literature claims about, not having structure. And a lot of this research that's been done using LCT has been published in this book that Carl told you about, Demystifying Critical Reflection, Improving Pedagogy and Practice with Legitimation Code Theory. It was edited by myself and Namali Tilakarata, who's going to present next week. And we divided the book into 3 parts: uncovering critical reflection, supporting critical reflection in pedagogy, and cultivating critically reflective students. So there are a lot of great chapters in the book, obviously, and a lot of, especially in the latter part of the book, you get the description of the pedagogical interventions about how to teach and assess critical reflection in different disciplines. So going back to our original project where it all started from, we called the project Knowledge Practices of Critical Thinking in Higher Education, Understanding the Disciplinary Requirements of Undergraduate Reflective Writing. And it was an ongoing multidisciplinary project between the University of Sydney Learning Centre, the National University of Singapore's Centre for English Language Communication, and the University of Sydney's LCT Centre for Knowledge Building. And if I'm not mistaken, out of these 3 centers, 2 don't exist anymore. And I think the Singapore Center for English Language Communication still exists. So the data that we have collected came from social work and business. We looked at high-scoring third-year undergraduate critical reflection essays that were 3,000 words. And high and low scoring second-year undergraduate reflective journals from business studies, and these were about 1,000 words. So I'm going to focus on the business reflective journals today. In business studies, critical reflection is often equated with problem solving and ethical decision making. And students are expected to examine their hidden assumptions and beyond the surface values using Solomon and Schell's framework of intercultural competence. I'll say a bit more about this framework in a minute. So the task itself, the reflective journal, was set within a core, senior, and challenging interdisciplinary unit in business. This task was designed to develop students' reflective practice and specifically their intercultural competence. We got ethics approval for analyzing 64 student assignments, so these students consented to their assignment being analyzed. And just an interesting side note that in this cohort of assignments, there were only 6 high distinctions and 11 students failed. And just for some comparability, we analyzed the 6 highest and the 6 lowest scoring assignments for this particular paper. So the framework that the students were expected to use for this assignment in the task where they were expected to critically reflect on their experience of multinational teamwork by examining their visible and invisible values, beliefs, assumptions, and behaviors, drawing on Solomon and Schell's model of intercultural competency. So this framework has 3 layers, 3 levels, where students are examining what they call the visible elements of culture on the surface. And then there's a hidden layer below the surface elements, and then the core elements of culture, things like mythology, folklore, etc., etc. You will see some examples from the data. So the research question that we asked was, to what extent can reflective assignments be analyzed for this study, be claimed to be empowering and emancipatory and enabling critical reflection as a process? And we drew on the LCT concepts of clusters and constellations, specifically focusing on an axiological form of clusters and constellations in which practices signal the aesthetic, ethical, moral, and political affiliations of actors. So I'm just going to quickly show you some of the key concepts that we used. So axiological clusters. In our work with Namely, we have analyzed recurring recognizable and recurring configurations or patterns of these kinds of meanings that have positive or negative charging. So we kind of built on Carl's concept of clusters, or axiological clusters, using SFL appraisal analysis. And then linked to other clusters, they can form a larger unit termed an axiological constellation. And Carl introduced these two terms, cluster boosting and cluster fucking, under axiological constellations, where tight association among the stances constituting a constellation can enable cluster boosting. And this means that where actors can benefit from the meanings associated with other positively charged stances that are closely connected with the stances they express, whether they engage with those stances or not. And then in terms of cluster fucking, conversely, actors can experience cluster fucking of other stances by association with other stances that are negatively charged, regardless, again, of whether they enact those stances or not. So what we're trying to do is figure out how the clusters and constellations are built, focusing on axiology. And in order to do that, we used an external language of description, the attitude system from appraisal in systemic functional linguistics, where we focus on resources of affect, so basically emotions, feelings, and then resources of judgment and appreciation that construct opinions. We also look at what these attitudes target. So what is the target of evaluation? That's just as important as the attitudinal item itself. So to give you an example, for example, so from the data,
Could I just,
yeah,
could you
jump
just
in.
say a bit more about the sort of negative, positive stuff around clusters and from the previous but one slide? Just so the slide before that, I mean, it's just the sort of basic LCT stuff. So could you just say a bit more about what positively charged and negatively charged actually mean?
Is it okay if I illustrate this through the data?
Yeah.
Because
Oh, okay.
this
That's what you're planning.
it's a bit abstract.
Yeah.
And I have tables where I actually show the clusters that are positively or negatively charged. Is
Yeah.
that all
Okay.
right?
You're planning.
Might make more sense, yeah. So here we were. So one example, for example, of negatively charged cluster is from the data we've got, my teammates' behavior seemed foreign to me. So this is what the student is saying. So the evaluative item is foreign, and this in appraisal terms is an example of negative judgment normality, targeting my teammates' behavior. When you have recurring patterns, so the student is saying the same thing over and over again using different types of expressions or different grammatical realizations, we can sum that up as a negatively charged cluster. So for example, in general, the students' peers are negatively evaluated, and I'm going to show you a few more examples. So from this extract
So,
here,
Eszter,
where
can
the
I just
student
jump
is,
in for a second?
yeah.
So, like, what I think you're saying is that when you've got something and then you've got some sort of judgment, I use that in the everyday meaning, some sort of judgment of the thing. So, pen, my lovely pen. Now we've got, and if that keeps coming back, you know, if I keep talking about my pen in positive ways through a text or a period of time, and it becomes a bit of a theme, that's a positively charged cluster, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like, so I'm just responding to Paul's sort of question in a slightly different
Yeah.
way, which is to say,
Right.
if you've got, say, you've got all these things in a text or a discourse, and then if something in there keeps getting sort of positively or negatively described, you know, good or bad, evil, ugly, fat, pretty, whatever, rich, whatever the positives or negatives might be, and it keeps coming back, even if they're using different words, then I think that's what you call a positively charged cluster or negatively charged cluster, because what happens is that thing, that item, my pen, starts to accumulate all this sort of like positive charging, like almost like an atom or something, and starts to, become all boosted up all the time with all these positivities through the course of a text.
Yeah.
So there's
Or negative.
the same thing coming up over and over again. Is that what's making it a cluster? Just
Yeah.
the fact
Yes.
it's the different statements throughout are being grouped together because they're actually talking about the same thing. Therefore, it's a cluster. And then it's what kind of words are associated with it, the adjectives, and are they positive adjectives or negative adjectives? Then is it a positive cluster or a negative cluster?
Yeah. On the next slide, you'll see a table where I was trying to make it a lot clearer that way to see how we can group these. So this is, again, just one example from the first text that I looked at, where the student is spreading negative evaluation across the text by judging his teammates and their behaviors negatively. So, for example, my group had 3 members from China, where communitarianism is generally valued, and other cultural differences, such as communication styles, made their behavior seem foreign to me. So I'm going to show you the analysis on the next slide. So this is where you see the first cluster, a negative repeated pattern of coupling negative evaluation with the student's peers. So the target is always the peers, my classmates, and they talk about the peers in different ways. Other group members, 3 members from China, their behavior, to use direct communication, my teammates, my Chinese workmates, the group. And you see these different attitudinal items, like they were less academically gifted than myself, foreign, their resistance, they fail to understand language or grammar, they do not understand the concepts, they looked at me blankly, and they have their lack of communication. So all of these things, their behavior is judged negatively in terms of their capacity and normality. So you see the same target being negatively evaluated over and over again by using essentially the same type of linguistic resource, which is negative judgment. I mean, the different type of judgment may change. Here we only have normality and capacity. And I'm using the criteria from the appraisal framework to decide what is what. But
So
this is how.
What's normality and capacity? Sorry, I must have missed.
Yeah, so basically, when you analyze linguistic resources, you categorize them based on different systems. And here, what I showed you earlier, judgment, I didn't go into the different types, but you can categorize linguistic resources based on normality. So how normal something is in a given cultural context, for example, how capable, how tenacious. And we also have things about ethics. So it's to do with social sanction and social esteem, basically. So how we judge people's, basically, it's judgments of people's behavior, and there are different types. And in SFL, we've got these probe questions that we ask. Is it to do with their tenacity? Is it to do with their capacity? Is it to do with their ethics? For example, are they truthful? That's veracity. And then we also have propriety, which is to do with ethics. So, based on these questions, we can categorize the different types of resources. Did that answer the question?
I just wanted to say
that's a generic categorization scheme, and not something specific for this.
Well, no,
Pardon?
that comes from systemic functional linguistics. So
Yes.
something Eszter said very, very quickly earlier on, you might have missed, and people might have missed, which is in this particular study that Eszter's talking about, the translation device, almost as it were, is from SFL. You don't have to use appraisal or the attitude system or something, but that's the one that Eszter's using as a means.
Yeah, this is just our
Just in case anybody's thinking, oh,
framework.
Christ, I don't remember reading any of this in the LCT literature. This comes from SFL.
Yes.
But you can still follow this. I mean, I don't really understand SFL, but you can still follow this because you can look at these things and think, yeah, that definitely is negative.
So, for example, if you wanted to go through this, you don't have to say what type. You could just say charging, and that's negative. You wouldn't even have to say judgment, for example, if you do an LCT analysis, because in LCT, in the 4C model that Carl introduces in one of the books, he has positive and negative charging. So in that column on the right-hand side, you could just put negative charging, and then you still get the cluster based on, how these different language elements are evaluated, basically, positively or negatively.
So
It's kind of intuitive for anyone, especially for native speakers.
Sorry, Paul?
So basically a cluster will have a mixture of capacity, normality, tenacity, whatever. That's not defining the cluster. It
depends, yeah. Yeah, it depends. But basically, we are looking for the same kind of linguistic resource piling up. If you can find them, then we get the cluster. If not, then that's something else.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Sorry,
Eszter,
I'm a bit quiet. This is completely new stuff to me, really, but that's helped a lot.
Can I just ask a quick question? Right now, we're talking about clusters, but also targets. Is a cluster made up of multiple targets, or what?
Can we try and avoid the word target, please? Target is a concept in LCT from autonomy, so can we just try and avoid that?
Yeah, that's why I was a little bit confused. So,
oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm using the SFL meaning here.
Oh, okay.
So, a coupling in SFL is target plus attitude, for example. And so that's the meaning I'm using here. And here it has to be related to the same thing. Like here, it's peers, the students' peers.
So is the peer an item in a cluster, or is the peer the cluster?
Yeah, so the cluster is the peer plus negative judgment. It has two elements. So it's a coupling of two things. And then the repeated pattern makes the cluster. So one line, the target plus the attitude is just a coupling of, two things. But when you have the repeated pattern, that makes the cluster in our framework, the way we analyze these things.
So the table is a cluster here. The whole table is the cluster.
Yeah. So the student's evaluation of his peers negatively is a cluster, yes. I also have in a couple of slides, I will show you the visualization.
Yeah, so basically what you're talking about, Eszter, is you kind of like looking at these ways in which people talk or write about somebody else or something, and then trying to see the pattern. See a pattern of whether they're saying they're a good thing or a bad thing. And in LCT, because it might be worth just signaling to people what's SFL and what's LCT, because a lot of people won't know.
Right.
But in LCT, we would just say, all right, it's negative charging or positive charging. And then what Eszter's doing here with this work is to kind of dig a bit deeper into that to say, well, what's the linguistics, what's the language that's used to generate that positive or negative charging? And that's where this attitude stuff comes from. In LCT, we don't tend to do that, but that's when if you were going to do SFL as well.
Yeah. It's been quite a long time since we did this analysis, so I have to remind myself of my own work as well. So another cluster that I'd like to show you is where the student is evaluating communitarianism, Chinese or Asian value, negatively again. So, for example, in the cluster about communitarian values, they pile up. Basically, they condense these different things into the cluster. Like, they talk about the commonly indirect Chinese style, or China, where communitarianism is generally valued. Again, Chinese style, other cultural differences such as communication, and then communitarianism as a general value. And again, as you see from the analysis, it's all negatively charged. It's foreign, it's commonly indirect, again, foreign. So something that's not considered normal in, for example, an Australian cultural context. So when we want to visualize them, basically we get these two clusters of negative judgment of the student's peers, and then also negative judgment of communitarianism. So basically the student, through piling up these negative language resources, evaluates the teammates' behavior as incapable and communitarianism as abnormal. So once you make the language resources explicit, some of the things that these students say are actually quite, well, stereotypical, I guess the word is. So I'm going to show you a longer extract and a bit more analysis, where the student is piling up resources of positive capacity of his own abilities. So I'm going to give you a minute. Instead of reading it out, I'll just give you a minute to read it. Okay, so you see here I highlighted all the positive resources: value, preference to act independently, to put an individual's own interest before any group's interests, success, positively impact, helping the group achieve, etc., etc. So basically, the student is opposing the Chinese value of communitarianism to the Australian value of individualism. And this is how he unpacks individualism through all these different, like what does it mean to be individualistic, like all these things about his own academic abilities and capacity. So if we wanted to visualize that, you see the oppositionally charged clusters in the assignment where individualism is opposed to communitarianism, and it's also positively evaluated as opposed to the negative value established by the student in this assignment. So then looking at this, the next question was, what other ideas the clusters of individualism and communitarianism were related to? What constellation is an idea part of? So looking at the other texts, yes.
Can I just say, like, one of the reasons why do you do this sort of analysis? So when I was thinking, maybe, is it because when we're looking at things like student work, or any kind of written or spoken discourse or whatever, that we get this feeling, particularly if we know the language really well, we get a feeling that something's being said that's a lot more. I'm asking if this is the reason. We get a feeling that something is being said that's a lot more than just what's being said. So that these are values that are being set up as good or bad, inside or outside, us and them, this sort of stuff. And this stuff is not made explicit. I mean, in particular, if you think about like all that work back a couple of decades ago, talking about seeing knowledge and talking about knowledge, and the stuff out of Bernstein and so on, where it's all about explicit knowledge and so on. And all that stuff always totally failed to understand anything that wasn't made extraordinarily explicit and was almost like physics. When we've got all these texts in humanities and social sciences and things like this, which actually say a lot more than what they say. So they kind of like, they give you a feeling that these are good or bad people or good or bad things to do. And we never, and it's really hard to get at that. So I think that's what you're trying to do here, is to try and see what's really being assessed in these assignments, because it's not just what people write about in the terms of I did this or I did that, or You know, I had this experience or that experience. I used this theory or that theory to make sense of it. I think what you're arguing is actually there's values. People's whole value system is being assessed. And so we have to kind of somehow make that explicit. And the first way of doing it is by thinking in terms of like, look at the words that are attached to something. And then that can become and if it's recurrent through a text of always being positive, always being negative, you have a charged cluster. And in your case, you've kind of gone, okay, and we can do this a bit more systematically by using some SFL to talk about the linguistic resources, the language that's being used to affect that. But for those people who don't deal with SFL, you can still do that if you can understand what the language is saying. And then you can see what's actually being assessed, which may not be what they say. It's maybe the feeling they give you. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And also sometimes, you know, in these texts, and there's another text that I'm not showing you today, but for it's a text too, actually, it's on the right in front of us. This text talks about history, heroes, mythology, folklore, mateship. So when you unpack each of these terms, you see that a lot of stuff is condensed in this. So, for example, when they talk about heroes, they talk about the Sir Donald Bradman in Australia, for example, this big sports hero. When they talk about folklore, they talk about the Australian diggers, for example, and they talk about you know, the settlers, and it's all very positively charged. So in each of the texts, when you see these values, you can actually unpack through the examples that the students mention what they consider folklore, what they consider mateship, etc., etc. And you see the same thing in the low scoring text, which I'll show you a bit later. So basically what you see here, the Australian values and the behaviors that are positively charged, they all relate to, I'm so sorry, someone is knocking on my door. So if you get distracted by that, I'm sorry.
Do you need to answer it?
Yeah, let me quickly go and see. I'm just gonna stop the video for a second.
I'm just gonna add something to what Eszter is saying. And yeah, off camera because I'm in my kitchen. Yeah, so I just think that what she's talking about in terms of these texts, all the implicit underlying communal values, one of the issues that we have is that whenever people talk about critical reflection as an assignment, they really emphasize the aspect of being critical. And there's this idea that somehow it transcends cultural stereotypes and transcends, I don't know how to put it, I'm sure Carl would know this better. But then you see that a lot of the lecturers are looking for a particular set of values. And if the students don't implicitly understand what those values are, they're not going to do well in those assignments. So a lot of these values appear to be, again, I'm sure Carl could put this better, but sort of Western ideas about what's considered acceptable in cultural contexts in terms of behavior or sort of value. But then also you see in my text, when I talk about it on the 18th of March, that a lot of the values that are considered positive in nursing about, you know, accepted behaviors within a discipline. Now, in a discipline and a professional context, I understand that because there's a certain sense that you have to be able to conform to disciplinary expectations so you can perform well in your job or be professional. But then you've also got instances where, in Eszter's case, these particular texts are pointing towards something that I think we all feel a little bit uncomfortable with, this idea that the lecturers are, in a sense, looking for the values that they themselves hold as being ideal. Does that make sense? And it's really hard to uncover that without having a framework like LCT and trying to make it really explicit and to show that to people, because it's an uncomfortable position to put someone into. You've got students coming from different cultures and you're trying to integrate them into this one culture, or you're valuing students who understand how to work within that cultural framework. So, I mean, I know that universities do that a lot. There seems to be a lot of graduate attributes and a lot of graduate, this idea that if you graduate from a Western university, you've got to have Western values in a sense. And I think that Eszter's work is really showing how that plays out in a text.
Was it Uber? Uber Eats?
Sorry, everyone. Sorry. No, it was actually the landlord. Anyway,
Can I just ask, given what you were just talking about, could you go back to just saying reminding me exactly what the task the students were set was? It was basically about multinational group work. So is the point of this to make them reflect on group work, or is it just something more general? Have they been working in a multinational team, and then this is them trying to supposedly reflecting on what went right and wrong in the team they were working in?
And
that's
they've been
exactly right.
framework, the Solomon and Shell framework for looking at sort of what are the underlying biases and the stereotypes and the things that influence the way in which you function in a team. I mean, this student is brilliant. They're actually taking all the cultural stereotypes and biases that they know exist within society against, for example, Chinese students or whatever their group mates, and then they're turning it around so that they actually show that their values are somehow, I don't know, they give it positive charging in a sense. So they try to say, okay, this is the reason why the team didn't work very well or cohesively. It's not that, we had different styles and ways of working. It's just that one way of working is better than the other. In a sense,
Yeah.
I mean, really well.
So that's basically them picking up what the lecturer expects them to say. This works or doesn't work, rather than really what they believe works, doesn't work. So essentially you're saying they got high marks because they worked out what the lecturer was expecting from
Yes,
them,
I mean, lots of students do
rather
that.
than what they believe really worked or didn't work, that might have been nothing to do with Australian versus foreign values.
Yeah. I mean, we find that a lot in our texts, right, Eszter, that the reflection texts, the students who do really well, some of them are being genuine, but some of them are also just very capable of performing in the right way at the right time. They understand what someone is looking for. I mean, a lot of academic texts, I suppose, have that element to it. You've got to figure out what works in that context, what the lecturer thinks is successful and a best example, and then work towards it. But here it's being done in a way, because it's with cultural values, it's sort of extremely implicit and also kind of subversive. Does that? So I don't know.
So it kind of links as well to the ideas of social capital, because people. This is something coming in a lot in Britain, for example, that there are lots of first generation university students who are coming not really having a clue what the game is about, and this is kind of one of the ways of making clear what the game. So you could do things like that and find why students are struggling in the first year, just because they've not come from a family or a school that actually know what to set them up for.
And also maybe point it out to the lecturers as well, right? So there's a lot of showing the lecturers as well, this is what, I don't know, it's quite valuable, I found, in even at NUS in that context at Singapore, to show the lecturers this is what's actually happening in the assignments. And sometimes they themselves are like, oh, I realize that I'm valuing these things over these things. They see it themselves when you show them explicitly, because everyone sees these things very intuitively, I think. And that's one of the problems with these assignments, is the intuitive aspect of trying to say what's good. I mean, a lot of critical thinking and critical reflection research shows that lecturers can't necessarily explicitly point to what is good in a text. They might just say, I feel like this is a really good text. It's a high distinction. It seems like a really strong example of the assignment I'm looking for. And that's what we found particularly problematic. So what about it is good? And we've done lots of different aspects of the research, and this is just one way of showing lecturers what is valued in those texts by successful students that are being rewarded for sort of displaying their capacity to replicate a particular set of cultural norms and values.
But the LCT clusters could also be used to show the students what's expected in a sort of an initial round of here's another essay modeling what we're expecting. So, I mean, the thing that Natalie said in the chat about it gives this great visual representation, that's the sort of thing that visual representation would be a brilliant thing to give the students in advance that shows them
So
what is expected.
that was the reason why we started this research when we were both tutoring in this unit called Critical Thinking in Business. And to be honest, we were quite horrified by the reflective assignments that the students had to write. And that's how we started analyzing these texts, like what is it they want in the first place? The students had no clue. The lecturers didn't even know what they expected. And students who, as Namali said, were able to sort of act in a performative way, then they got high distinctions. But, you know, so, and I'm going to get to this a bit later about how we started this project and then all of the things that we identified. And then that's when the, you know, critical questions came up about our own work in terms, because first we only concentrated on, okay, how can we make this all visible so it can be taught so students aren't completely lost? But I'm not going to go there just yet because I'm going to talk about it a bit later. So basically, as you can see here, in all of these texts, the students are evaluating these Australian values positively and then opposing them to the foreign values. So whatever, you know, it's whether it's faith or the silence or collectivism or whatever they point out in these assignments. So to visualize it, basically, by evaluating Australian values, and there were several, obviously, like I'm showing you examples of one individual cluster or another, but these are all linked in a constellation. So the assignments cluster boost Australian values and essentially cluster fuck foreign values because they are basically contrasted to each other. And the interesting thing is that the low scoring students do the same. And that was something that was very interesting and quite sad to see, actually. So I'm going to move on and show you some examples from the low scoring students' text where they still engage in deficit discourses. And this is basically negative self-talk and a focus on failure.
Sorry, before you do, Eszter, there's just something that I'm not quite clear on, and you might have said so, but I might have missed it. And that is this Australian students talking about their experiences of working in a group with other, you know, and is it the Australian students who are negatively charging the Chinese kids in their group, or is it have you got Chinese students who are also talking about their experiences, or are you only looking at what the Australian students are saying about working in a team?
I'm looking at both. So I'm looking at both, and the high distinction students are all local Australian. And the ones that I'm showing you, these low scoring assignments, are all the international and mostly Chinese students.
Okay, sorry, I missed that.
And later on, I'm also going to show you how in the low scoring assignments or among the international student cohort, there are no high distinctions at all, not even distinctions. So that's another, you know, interesting thing to talk about, actually. So even though, as Namali said, the local Australian students who got high distinctions are capable of reproducing the Australian values and norms expected by the lecturers, but and you know, this is a point we make later that doesn't really move beyond othering and stereotyping. So anyway, we'll come back to this question.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
No worries. So this text is from a low-scoring Chinese student assignment, and they evaluate Chinese values and behaviors as weaknesses and Australian values as strengths. So I'm going to give you a minute to just read it.
Oh, it is a really good reflective set of statements.
And the poor thing got a really bad mark for it.
Yeah, I agree. That's
So-
really, really insightful.
So basically, here you have these evaluated targets. So less talking will be devalued. So it will be devalued is an example of negative judgment of the student's own behavior, right? Or the Chinese students in general talk less. My contribution will be devalued. Our traditional attitude, humility, becomes a weakness. Talking more, contributing more. So that's the coupling, right? All of this is evaluated as weaknesses. So it's almost like there's an extra recasting item. So a value that was positive in their own culture is now negative. It's a weakness in the Australian educational context. Whereas in comparison, Australian students talking more, contributing more, their ideas are better. The Western students explain what they have done. So we, the Chinese students, need to adjust our own behavior. So these couplings get reevaluated as strengths. So if there's double evaluation going on, negatively evaluating something that originally is positive in their own culture, the Chinese values, and then reinforcing the positivity of the Australian values. You see what's going on? So originally positive Chinese values get recast as negative. But the originally positive Australian values are evaluated positively once again as a sign of capacity by using the word strength. So basically, Australian values and behaviors here are axiologically positively charged because they are constructed as the ideal values that the Chinese students feel they're expected to conform to in order to be successful students in the Australian educational context. So if we want to...
Can I just ask there, did you have any evidence of Australian students who actually criticised the dominant clusters? Were there any evidence of that? Okay.
No. I looked for it, but couldn't find any. So basically, not only the Australian students are cluster-fucking Chinese values, but also the low-scoring Chinese students are cluster-fucking their own values. The cultural values that differ from Western values as they are evaluated as weaknesses. And if you look at this harmony, trust, silence, conflict avoidance, I mean, don't we usually think of harmony and trust as something good? And then these poor students, are basically criticizing these as not something helpful to succeed in Australia. So if we look at the other text, all the Chinese values and behaviors are negatively charged by the Chinese students themselves. And none of them got a high mark. These are all low-scoring assignments, remember. So they talk about things like face-saving, politeness, introversion, wisdom, propriety, diligence. These are all typically considered positive characteristics irrespective of culture. Some of them are universal values. And some of these can be unpacked. For example, respect can be unpacked as someone is respectful to make explicit the positive judgment that it encodes, respectful as an adjective. A lot of all these values could be unpacked and made more explicit, linguistically speaking. So looking at these findings, so what? Basically, all of the high-scoring reflective journals engage in deficit discourses by stereotyping and othering their peers. So none of the students were able to move beyond that, and they still got a high distinction. The low-scoring assignments also engage in deficit discourses, but it relates to the self, not others, by engaging in negative self-talk and a focus on their own failure, in not being able to behave in a way that's expected in an Australian context of educational culture. And then both the high and low scoring reflective journals show that demonstrations of success of critical reflection involve cluster boosting Australian values as opposed to cluster fucking Chinese values. and then consistent with the results of previous research that identified this. So these findings are consistent with the results of previous research that identified a high level of negativity in Western reflective writing. So this was the point where we started problematizing the assessment of critical reflection. And basically, we can call it, I guess, with Namely and I, our own self-reflection and critique of our own research. So our original concern was that a small number of students were getting a high grade for these assignments. So we became interested in uncovering the expectations of success, what was the basis of achievement, and we conducted interdisciplinary LCT and SFL systemic functional linguistic analysis to understand what knowledge practices and linguistic resources are at stake in successful demonstrations of critical thinking. So what we found from a...
Did you actually
Eszter, sorry.
Did you actually ask the lecturers what they thought they were scoring for? Did they have any kind of marking scheme or anything that you could go on that they had some rational different reason for why those students got high and low marks?
Not really. I mean, the description of the assignment was pretty vague, and the students were basically directed to use the Solomon and Shelf framework of intercultural competence. And that's another thing in terms of designing assessments. A lot of these assignments, a lot of the assignment instructions aren't very clear, aren't very explicit. So students basically, I guess, they just try to figure out what the lecturers want. And after I did this research, and my PhD was based on another business assignment, the lecturers did try to make the syllabus and the marking rubrics a bit more explicit and clear, but obviously not before, we analyzed all these steps.
Was there a semantics thing at all going on, Eszter? Like in relation to the Chinese students kind of reflecting more on the self and Australian students drawing more on the theoretical framework, for example? And the example that you gave seemed to be sort of the Australian students' reflections seemed to be sort of more outwardly facing, whereas the Chinese students seemed to be more inwardly facing. Was there anything like that? Sort of the higher assignments sort of reaching higher and connecting to frameworks in a way that the lower ones didn't?
The lower ones did as well. I mean, just because the Australians focused on others and stereotyping their peers, and the Chinese students focused on their own behavior, they still linked it to the Solomon and Self framework of culture. So they still talked about the values. So if we go back and look at the, where is it? So for example, if you see the Chinese values and behaviors, I mean, just because it's not a Western, or local Australian value system, it's basically either Taoism or Confucianism in these assignments. It's still linked to a value system of a particular culture. So they did use the Solomon and Shelf framework, but they were still marked down. And a lot of these student assignments obviously didn't have perfect grammar. And we know that a lot of lecturers get hung up on, structural and grammatical issues, even if it doesn't, even the grammatical error, if the grammatical error doesn't hinder meaning, students still will be marked down for their use of language.
So were you actually able to pin? Were you actually able to pin down why it was that the Chinese students got lower marks?
You mean by talking to the lecturers?
Well, either between the analysis and talking to lecturers.
Yeah, not really.
Yeah, okay, interesting.
Not really. Yeah.
Eszter, could something like this be used with the lecturers to improve their rubrics or their criteria, or the levels of competence, just to kind of develop their rubrics where...
Yeah, so with respect to the other assignment I analyzed, the country report, they did. But when I emailed them with these findings, nobody even responded. They weren't interested whatsoever in the research. And yeah, so that's
well, it's uncomfortable what you're pointing at, Eszter. It's maybe that's not so weird, but it's really important work and deserves to be looked at. I'm sorry that they didn't answer.
No. So basically, you know, in the first round after the these analysis, and as Naomi said, we looked at these assignments a million times from different angles. I mean, we did start in 2012, so it's more than 10 years now. It's crazy. So from a theoretical perspective, these assignments demonstrated the capacity to create semantic waves. So students moving between more abstracted, you know, concepts and personal experiences, for example, describing their experience of multinational teamwork. But even though the literature says that, you know, reflective writing is like engaging in creative play, we uncovered that successful students actually deployed structured and formulaic use of linguistic resources, and the high-scoring text did conform to a uniform genre structure and draw similar recurring linguistic resources to demonstrate critical reflection. In the high-scoring text, we also saw mastery of constructing axiologically charged clusters of meaning, and these, instead of, you know, how the literature said that these are to challenge, the reflection is to challenge the status quo, well, all of them align with rather than challenge or question the disciplinary values of their academic disciplines. And in Sue McKenna's and Kirsten's book, we have a chapter, and this is in this chapter we call this, instead of challenging the status quo, what we saw was actually uncritical reproduction. So much for critical reflection. Hey, in terms of pedagogy, we could say that you know, our findings could contribute to explicit teaching of these highly complex resources that empower students to produce successful critical reflection assignments. So we could show them how, you know, we could deconstruct the genre structure. We could model how to skillfully use the right kind of linguistic resources to link subjective experiences to theoretical frameworks. And we could expose students to the cultivated gaze of their academic disciplines. We could, you know, apprentice them into the conventions of their discipline and their professional practice. But that's when we started asking critical questions of ourselves, and I guess these are questions for us all. When we started identifying problematic examples of demonstrating successful critical reflection, and normally we'll have some amazing examples for you next week. Well, she will show how social work student on field work is sexually harassed by a client, and then she still says it's almost like self-victim blaming. So questions to ask, I guess, is whether we simply identify the parameters of success, or did we also contribute to reinforcing the status quo? What if we have uncovered the rules of the game, and instead of deconstructing existing hierarchies of power, by teaching students the rules of the game, we just basically contribute to historic assimilationist expectations in the context of this Australian business unit? What if, instead of being empowered, students from a non-mainstream background feel disempowered by this process, by what they are expected to do? And if these students justify their prejudices and negative attitudes by citing their internalized Australian values as the reason, does this count as evidence of acquiring the skills of intercultural competence? Is criticality evident in such reflection? So a note on low scoring assignments that I wanted to mention. All of these assignments mostly failed and passes with a small number of credits. Each of these texts were framed around Chinese values. So I guess it goes back to your question, Steve, about, you know, using the framework. They all did. They cited Confucianism 5 out of the 6 texts. So going back to previous research, Guy points out that an important intention of reflective practice is to improve what we do. But our critical question is, how does devaluing students' cultural background and their feeling disempowered improve student learning? And then post-graduation professional behavior. So the disconnect between intention and university mission statement, and then the experience recounted in these business reflective journals is quite apparent. So going back to the question of the title of the talk, Empowering Whom? So in this case, I think we have a poorly designed reflective assignment. And in this one particular example, we could see it as limiting rather than empowering students' agency. We could see it as contributing to deficit discourses rather than challenging the status quo as opposed to the literature, and coercing disclosure of private, sensitive, or confidential information rather than allowing freedom of expression. Of course, I have to acknowledge the limitations of the study because this was a very small size. The data set was very small from a single unit of study in a single academic discipline. And our findings obviously cannot be generalized, but they do resonate with previous research on the ethical dimension of assessing critical reflection. And mostly this is to do with Western bias or the application of taken for granted Western understanding of teaching and learning to Asian students, which result in deficit models of assessing Asian students' critical thinking skills. And Namali and her colleagues at NU did a lot more research on this, especially because they were located in an Asian context. So before I show you our recommendations and hopefully the way forward, I want to stop for a moment for this discussion question and say, how should we as academics critically reflect on the ethicality of assessing reflective assignments so that these tasks enable rather than constrain students' learning to become self-reflective practitioners? So just curious also of your own experiences. I mean, these reflective assignments are, starting to be widely used across all disciplines, even scientific disciplines like, I don't know, in medical schools or engineering. So yeah, just wondering what your experiences are in your own context. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I'll come back to the slides later. I just want to stop sharing so we can all see each other.
I don't set reflective assignments. I mean, nothing
I think
against
a lot
them.
of
It's
people,
just don't, because I suppose there's a sense in which there is a little bit, because I do a little bit because we have tubes that are enormous, and we're not allowed to, we have to have three. See, this is so unpedagogic, the reasons for why you do things. So we have to have three sources of marking. We can't just do it on mid and end semester stuff. And we also need to make sure that they're contributing all the way through. So when you have like 35 people in a room, you can't mark tutorial participation or engagement because you don't remember anybody who's in the room. So we do these weekly discussion posts, which are supposedly critical reflection posts. And I just remembered that I do actually therefore I do critical reflection assignments. But I just try to, what I do is I try to teach them, not that they listen, but many of them, but I try to teach them to just wave in, it's only 1 or 2 paragraphs, but just, can you connect what you've read, because they do it on a reading. So they have a reading and they have to do some critical reflection on the reading. So they don't necessarily have to use their own personal experiences. And I just try and say, you don't have to use that only, and just connect the ideas to something else, really. That's it. Because otherwise we are, I mean, where there's a reason, like reflecting on professional experience, I can understand it being used. But in sociology, third-year sociology unit, asking people to use their personal experiences is effectively asking them to lay more of themselves open for my assessment and surveillance. And anyone who's read any Foucault should know that, which is, the more you ask people to reflect on themselves to be assessed, the more you're subjecting them to a disciplining gaze.
Yeah, I think, a lot of my colleagues introduced critical reflection, and I did the same in a research report because people are worried about students using AI, and they think, well, if you ask a reflective question or there's at least a component, then, AI won't help you because you just need to, use your own critical thinking skills. Although in my experience, students used AI even to write a critical reflection component of an assignment. So I guess we can't get away from it anyway.
No reason why,
Nora, just jump in.
No reason why an AI can't write a critical piece. It just depends how many critical pieces are out there on the web. If the web is full of people's critical writing, then AIs will be brilliant at it, but just following the model of what the mass of stuff out there is, which probably will be a Western version of it because they're sucking up mainly Western text, presumably.
But you know what I started to do, Eszter? You know what I started to do? I asked them to reflect on how they used AI in their assignment.
That's brilliant, yeah. Would you mind telling us a bit more about it?
Because it's just we talk about AI a lot, and I tell them that I'm actually interested in the process and how they respond to it. And they say so. I learned so much about AI through this reflective component because they do tell me. So it's good. I don't know. I just use it for that now these days.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, read her paper. It's brilliant. It was just published.
Shush.
You think there's a difference in a reflective assignment that's asking them to reflect on themselves and how they did, which is what this seemed to be mainly doing, them meaning the whole group potentially, versus reflecting on the work? Because we have an MSc module where the coursework is writing a client report essentially, but we have marks for and say they have to have a section at the end that is reflect on the process, where what I'm really wanting them to do is sort of point out, where the limitations essentially of what went wrong and what went right and how they could do better if they did it again. But they're absolutely terrible. And actually, a lot of them hardly do anything for that section.
Right. Yeah.
And rarely does anybody write anything that I think that was really, really good, because they just, part of it, if they say anything, they tend to feel like they have to say, I did really well. And I said, I haven't ever got across the idea of what I am after with that. But it feels like that there ought to be, there's something else going on with that versus reflecting on yourself, maybe. But
I think some of the push for this sort of stuff comes from the same sort of drive as the word authentic and other words like that, where people are trying to sort of get, because all of this drive towards this sort of approach came before the academic panic about AI, didn't it? And I think a lot of it is, some sort of desire to engage students in many ways. I get a very lame sort of thing, and I tell students not to do it, but again, it depends on whether they listen or not, which is that because mine's a critical reflection on a reading, they'll often say, this reading opened my eyes and made me think. And then they summarize the reading and they say, this is really interesting and I hadn't thought about this before. And I just fail them. It's like that I told you not to do. Just saying I really liked it. It's good. It's not what I'm calling critical reflection. But I get the feeling that's one of the ways they think it should be done, which is to say, it really made me think about these things.
It's interesting that you say that, because we had exactly the same experience in Adelaide in an undergraduate unit. And this was a unit, pre-service features, and they also had to reflect on readings. And they commented a lot on the concept. and said the same thing what you just said, Carl, that, oh, it really made me think, and there was a bit of self-criticism, just like you saw in my business text, that, I didn't understand this concept. But now that, I did this course and read this reading, now I realized that I have to think more about it along these lines. And obviously it was very shallow and superficial. So it's interesting that you had the same experience in a completely different discipline. Might go back to my slides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, bring us to a conclusion.
Yeah. So basically, when we thought about, all this Western bias that was identified in previous research, and our findings pretty much just confirm the same thing, we also looked up what research exists in terms of decolonializing critical reflection from Western assumptions. There's a bit of work on critical social work from neoliberalism. So that's something that also research in intersectionality deals with, for example. There's some research on decolonizing Eurocentric critical reflection research methodology by including indigenous perspectives. And then Jody Martin and Jennifer Walshmar, actually in our Demystifying Critical Reflection book, they have a chapter on how they empower students to produce reflective writing that does not fit typical patterns by intentionally enacting an inclusive pedagogy. So they actually describe their entire intervention. So it would be interesting reading if you're interested. And we have a couple of recommendations for universities that we need to move beyond simply uncovering the rules of the game and making expectations visible, and essentially what could be seen as soliciting confessions through critical reflection, and work towards intentionally decolonizing the practices of critical reflection and its assessment to ensure that it becomes an ethical, equitable, and empowering activity for all students. So going back to my low scoring Chinese students text, I don't see any reason why those students were marked down so harshly, even though they used a completely different cultural framework, for example. When I read those texts, I didn't think they were only a pass or in some cases a fail. So it would be interesting to see how different markers would mark the same text, if there was some alignment. And I bet that there would be differences depending on who the marker is. So, and then just to conclude why LCT, we found it very valuable for revealing that both Australian and Asian students engage in critical reflection through individualistic rather than cooperative ways, which has enabled us to shed light on the ethical concerns associated with assessing reflective writing in the context of Australian business higher education.